There's a wild turkey that makes her rounds in my neighborhood. One of two that appeared when wildlife was reclaiming the urban landscape during the pandemic lockdown. She always looks so lonely to me, and I can't help but project my own emotions onto her as she struts from place to place looking for something to eat, and I suspect sometimes looking for a mate. You may call this sentimentalism, but I'd like to think it's empathy. I'm fond of her, although she's rather indifferent towards me. I want to be her friend, but she can't be bothered with my overtures, although she seems to have a thing for the neighbor across the street who lures her with scoopfuls of bird feed. Maybe the bird feed I put out is somehow lacking in presentation or missing some secret ingredient that she gets across the street. Perhaps she thinks the neighbor's yard is tidier and more nicely landscaped than mine. She'd be correct. Sometimes she stands for what seems like an eternity at the neighbor's front door, although I haven't been able to figure out whether she's waiting for him to come outside or gazing at her own reflection in the glass, perhaps seeing a friend. It could be that she prefers the shelter of his wooden porch to my unprotected concrete steps. My screen door is aluminum, so I've wondered if I should mount a mirror to it in an effort to appeal to her vanity, or at least her need to see herself. I don't have the courage to mount a picture of myself on the assumption that it is the neighbor attracting her to the front door. I've seen her in my backyard taking refuge in the makeshift rabbit shelter that I fashioned out of an old outdoor fireplace and some scrap lumber, lining it with straw. And she sometimes hovers around the cars in the driveway or under the large oak tree in our front yard. I've watched her chase both small dogs and small children, so I long ago realized that she can take care of herself. But it's hard for me to let her be wild. So I watch her from the window whenever she's in the vicinity, delighted by her presence and fascinated by her movements. She probably finds me creepy, and I suppose I am, especially given the cognitive dissonance between my excessive interest in her and her movements and the distant relation of hers who is currently in my freezer. We've also seen deer and foxes return to the neighborhood, joining the rabbits and squirrels and raccoons that have lived there since we moved into our current home more than 30 years ago. Fortunately for us, the skunks moved out of the neighborhood a couple of years after we arrived. I'm not sure if they found us, well, odorous or what, but they left. In the midst of the city, or at least one of its inner suburbs, we see glimmers of wildlife, although it is hardly a wilderness. It is an urban landscape with all of the roadways and parking lots, housing and office buildings, industrial parks and shopping malls, planes flying overhead and trucks roaring by. The green spaces are but remnants of the forests and meadows that once dominated the landscape. The bison that roamed across the plains at Silver Heights only a century and a half ago are long gone. The creeks and ponds have been paved over. Wildflowers and brush have given way to manicured lawns and ornamental gardens. The wildlife that remains is just a vestige of the abundant fauna that greeted the first settlers. What is nature? Asks Peter Walleben in The Secret Wisdom of Nature. Is it untouched tropical forests or remote mountains with unscaled peaks? What about flower-filled alpine meadows grazed by dun-colored cows with large bells swinging from their necks? There are probably as many definitions out there as there are people who love nature. One simple standard definition is that nature is the opposite of culture. That is to say, everything that people have not created or changed. Other definitions see people and their activities as part of nature. Walleben leans in the direction of seeing nature as the opposite of culture. And by implication, this means that the wilderness should not be confused with the garden. He sees the human transition from hunters and gatherers to farmers as the line of demarcation between humans as part of nature and humans as distinct from it, even though they remain dependent upon it. I lean in the direction of continuing to see people and human activities as integral parts of nature, even though overpopulation and human exploitation of the environment have had toxic effects on the world's ecological balance. In her testimony before the United States Senate in 1995, conservationist and author Terry Tempest Williams said, "To be whole, to be complete, wildness reminds us what it means to be human, and that we are connected to rather than what we are separate from." Even before I was born, Rachel Carson maintained, far from being the overlord of all creation, humankind is itself part of nature, subject to the same cosmic forces that control all other life, insisting that our welfare, and probably even our survival, depend upon learning to live in harmony rather than in combat with these forces. But in locating humans and our activities within nature, it remains the case that human activity and colonization has destroyed much of the wilderness. Although a new wilderness would quickly overtake the earth if humans were suddenly to disappear from it. The world without us would be just fine. By contrast, we without the world would, well, not exist. We're replacing the wild with the tame, observed David Attenborough, who went on to note, half of the fertile land on Earth is now farmland. 70% of the massive birds on this planet are domestic birds, the vast majority chickens. We account for over 1/3 of the weight of mammals on the earth. A further 60% are the animals we raise to eat. The rest, from mice to whales, make up just 4%. Despite these troubling statistics, there are still vast amounts of wilderness in the world, even if half of the fertile land is under cultivation, and even if the human footprint in the wilds is larger than we might wish it to be. And just as weeds have a way of breaking through the pavement, pockets of wilderness have a way of occupying the spaces between human habitation. Our village life would stagnate if it were not for the unexplored forests and meadows which surround it. We need the tonic of wildness, declared Henry David Thoreau in Walden. His account of heading to the woods to live deliberately. 170 years have passed since Walden first appeared in print, when the North American wilderness was already in retreat and under threat. But the romance of life in the woods is still the dream of many, and Thoreau's experiment has inspired countless souls in their environmental consciousness. It has informed our liberal religious tradition, one of few religious traditions that I believe place nature and its well-being at the heart of religion and not at the periphery, that understand humans as being served by and servants of the natural world, and not a species that was given dominion over it. I should be glad if all the meadows on the earth were left in a wild state, Thoreau said, if that were the consequence of people beginning to redeem themselves. It's been nearly 20 years since my wife Cindy and I bought a cottage north of Gimli, where we retreat on weekends, summer and winter, and will soon spend even more time. It's hardly in the wilderness, but the neighborhood is thinly populated compared to much of cottage country, and our little piece of paradise, which we call Huldecott, the hidden croft, is nestled in the woods. Ash and poplar, birch and spruce, wild roses and raspberries, daisies and lady slippers. Several deer trails lead through the yard, and Cindy, being something of a deer whisperer, can tell the regulars apart from one another and has dubbed several with their own names. We receive regular visits from ravens and crows, though never at the same time, and they compete for our attention outside the kitchen window and even bring us gifts from time to time. Foxes come and go. There's a lynx in the neighborhood that some mistake for a cougar. Coyotes can be heard in the distance, and there's at least one bear that wanders through the yard, even though I have assured Cindy there were no bears along the western shore of Lake Winnipeg, south of Noosa. This bear leaves evidence and answers the question of what bears do in the woods. They don't. They do it in the clearing in my yard. Cindy has been anxious about bears since she was a child, but I'm more anxious about mushrooms and poison ivy. Surprise, surprise, 2 years after we acquired Huldecott, Manitoba Conservation placed a bear trap at the top of the road. Oops, my mistake, dear. In pleasant weather, Cindy walks the 800 feet to the lake to watch the sunrise, and whenever she can rouse me, which is less frequent than you might imagine, she drags me along with her. Rise free from care before the dawn and seek adventures, advised Thoreau. Sure. I'm more with his let the noon find thee by the lakes and the night overtake thee everywhere at home. Grow wild according to thy nature. This wild creature likes to sleep in. I prefer to watch the sunset through the trees, but dawn brings the wildlife out of their hiding places. So there are additional rewards to being with the sun at the beginning of the day rather than at the end. Eagles soar overhead, scanning the lake for breakfast, while the occasional fox scampers along the bank next to the beach. The deer watch us from their shelter in the woods, and we often hear hawks screeching overhead, both morning and evening, as they keep watch for small mammals and other birds. It is remarkable how many creatures live wild and free, though secret, in the woods, and still sustain themselves in the neighborhood of towns, Thoreau observed. Some wilderness is just beyond our doorstep. But even our home in the country is a garden, not a wilderness. We may be surrounded by wild things and enjoy abundant wildlife, but the land there is not in an entirely wild state. We are surrounded by farmland and forest, hemmed in on one side by a magnificent lake, and not far from there by other woodlands and other farms. There are power lines and gas lines, paved roads and telephones. When I joke about roughing it like my ancestors with only dial-up internet, the conditions are nothing like what they knew when they brought the plow to the land and grazed their livestock on its pastures. It's wildish, not wilderness. Yet it feels wilder and less tamed than the city. I've been visiting the Manitoba Interlake since before I can remember, literally. My earliest memories are of wide open fields and flat landscapes and the long, monotonous drive to get to the beach, where things finally would get interesting. As an adult, I have traveled in the Interlake several times a month, observing changes to the flora and fauna over the course of 4 decades. There is much more forest cover than there was when I was young, largely through the efforts of the Nature Conservancy. More wildlife than I remember, including deer and bear, fishers and wolves, redwings and hawks, eagles, and even the occasional osprey. The populations have grown substantially, and outside the farming districts and cottage developments, the Interlake seems wilder than it has been in more than a century. I love the wild not less than the good, affirmed Thoreau, and the abundance of wildlife beyond Winnipeg city limits is good indeed. For years, I enjoyed the peace and quiet of the countryside without paying much attention to the wildlife. You can't have a meaningful conversation with a deer. Or so I thought. The past 20 years have changed my thinking, and I can now say that I have learned a great deal from the wildlife that wander through my yard, both at Hildekott and here in the city. As Job declared to his fair-weather friends, "But ask the animals, and they will teach you, the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you." Even the passing glimpse of an animal in the wild thrills us, from foxes to fireflies, hawks to hummingbirds, and rabbits to raccoons. And when we're able to catch more than a glimpse, observing them closely and discerning their habits, listening for their ways of communicating which are beyond words, we may experience something akin to communion, a communion that we share with the other creatures of the earth. Rachel Carson believed that the awareness of nature, its beauty and its wildness, were crucial to the spiritual development of individuals and society as a whole. Those who dwell among the beauties and mysteries of the earth are never alone or weary of life, she suggested. Whatever the vexations or concerns of their personal lives, their thoughts can find paths that lead to inner contentment and to renewed excitement in living. Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. As human beings, she held, we are part of the whole stream of life. Our origins are of the earth, and so there is in us a deeply seated response to the natural universe, which is part of our humanity. Please join in hymn number 21 for the beauty of the earth. In the final verse, I would ask you to replace the words sister, brother, etc. with sibling, cousin, parent, child.